This episode is dedicated to all my marine social science people out there. One in particular, I'm thinking about Dr. Ed Hind-Ozan. Haven't talked to him in a while, haven't seen him in a while just because of COVID, and he lives across the pond. But we've had many conversations about the importance of social science in marine conservation. And there's a new book called Conservation Social Science, Understanding People, Conserving Biodiversity. It's all about social science, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Why it's so important to discuss human behavior around conservation on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening in the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about what's happening in the ocean, a new book that's on sale called Conservation Social Science, Understanding People and Conserving Biodiversity. It argues that human behavior is often overlooked when it comes to developing conservation solutions, which ultimately requires changing the way people interact with the environment. So effective conservation requires understanding the consequences for species and ecosystems as well as people and their livelihoods. So this is one of those things where, it's kind of interesting when I go back to when I first started as a scientist, back in the day. It's been a while, about 20 years or so, maybe over that. I started going into science. I started getting interested in science when I was in high school and going through biology and stuff. I always got frustrated because we're always going over human biology, and I want to go over marine biology. I wanted to do like the environment, all the environmental sort of impacts. I wanted to talk about, dolphins. I want to talk about whales. I want to talk about sharks. I want to talk about fish, coral reefs, all that kind of stuff. I remember even going to my biology teacher in high school and asking if I can do a different project that focused on the environment rather than on humans. And I kept getting frustrated. I'm like, why? I want to just talk about the science of the environment, the science of the ocean. That's what I wanted to talk about, because that's how I thought we protect the ocean, right? That's what conservation was to me, was always the science behind everything. And unfortunately, I had to learn the hard way. Not really the hard way, but over time, I learned that, yes, science is important to understand what's happening in the ocean. It's why we talk about what's happening in the ocean, the trends that we see. And you probably hear this on a fairly regular basis if you're looking up things about the ocean. You hear about plastic pollution, you hear about climate change, the science behind how it affects animals. You hear about overfishing, you hear about marine pollution, you hear about coastal development, and what the negative impacts are on, all the things I talked about, ocean and its species. And it's good to know, but it can get really depressing on, how do we tackle these big problems? How do we get people to understand, that because we know this science, we need to change? And that was always frustrating to me when I was in university and just sort of early career scientist out of university. I was like, let's follow the science. It's all about the science. I remember having conversations in the early 2000s with my parents about climate change and my brother about climate change. My brother would have been the best lawyer because he's so good at debating. And he used to drive me nuts, actually, because of it, because he was so good at arguing. And we get along, but it was just, he still does it sometimes. But he used to be so good at, he's like, well, people just don't, can't just change. We talked about climate change and how we need to change. And that was back in the early 2000s. I'm like, we're already too late. Like, things are already happening. It's going to get worse. And he's just like, well, people don't want to change. We have all this stuff. And he made some really good points. And at that point, I started to really think, people matter in conservation. People matter in science. And if we don't, get people to understand and motivate them to change the way and people, is myself as well, like people as a society, if we don't change, then we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to protect the planet. We're not going to protect the ocean. We all need to change, and we all need to understand how people react to conservation. That's why this book that I'm talking about today, which I'll put the link to the article on Conservation International's website, and it's like, it talks about why it's so important for conservationists to include people, to get their feedback, to understand marginalized, like the sort of the opinions and the needs of marginalized communities, the needs of local communities. It says here in the book, it says like one of the summaries of it is that conservationists can navigate key questions that surround establishing a protected area by using political science lens, such as who has the power to make the rules, whose voices are underrepresented. The answers to these questions have profound implications for people, for both nature and people. So it goes on, it says, the book also calls for impact evaluation, an approach that can help us understand how the design and management of a conservation project affects not only the species and ecosystems, but also the lives and livelihoods of local people who depend on them. That's why it's always interesting when you have people who make these environmental documentaries, and they talk about we need to stop. Like one of them a couple of years ago that came out was all about talking to get rid of like Seaspiracy, to get rid of seafood, stop eating seafood. But you have to remember, how does that affect people around the world? The creators came out and said, oh, well, we're really talking about people in North America. We have a lot of fisheries in North America. We have a lot of fishing communities, fishing families that their livelihoods depend on fishing. And they do their best to do it in the, follow all the regulations, whether they like it or not, provide feedback, team up with scientists and researchers and conservationists to provide, something that, shows that they want to keep this livelihood sustainable, not only from an environmental perspective, but also from a perspective where, hey, we want to continue to do this. We want to have our livelihoods, but we want to protect the ocean as well at the same time. And Seaspiracy was like, we should stop eating seafood, and the people who gather seafoods all of them are overfishing, and they're all bad, and all this. That's what a lot of people got out of that movie. And without that social science aspect, you lose the focus of who's involved in the ocean, who's using the ocean, and why aren't we doing more to help these people out, to talk to these people, to include these people? These are stakeholders. These are ocean users. These are people. These are people who are involved in the ocean, who make their living from the ocean, who depend on the ocean for their, basically their lives. It fuels their lives in a certain sense. And we often don't include them, or we weren't before, and it's only really starting to happen now. And social science brings in that aspect, right? When you have social science coming into the field of conservation, you are including people in the way you manage the ocean. Conservation really helps manage the people around the environment. I remember talking to Dr. Ed Hines about this. Ed Hines was on about this. He's a good friend of mine. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. There's a reason. We've had some great conversations about it. And I remember him telling me, and I don't know if I'm getting the phrase exactly right, but I remember him telling me, he's like, conservation is sort of the method of managing people around the environment, understanding how they use the environment, what's important to them, and if they need to adapt, how they can adapt while keeping and maintaining the status quo if possible. And it's a fascinating field. It requires information about the psychology of people, and knowing how to put a survey together, knowing how to interact with different ocean users, speaking the language of fishers and developers, and people like tourist operators and so forth, people who use the ocean. You have to be able to connect with all of them. You can't just be a scientist behind a computer, crunching the numbers to get information out of people. That's not how, and then telling people, hey, this is what the numbers are saying. This is what we need to do. Oftentimes we have to work in and around. We have to find out what's important, for the community, right? That's using the ocean, and I think that's something that's extremely important. I remember having a representative from a scientist from RARE on RARE, rare.org. And what they do is they go into communities. They have this program called Fishing Forever. They go into communities. They are invited into communities, and they offer their expertise, but they help them understand, or they help them get what they need. Not just help them understand, they help them get what they need. So they find out what's important for those communities. I remember one example was a fishing community. I believe it was near Indonesia. And they were saying that they wanted to be recognized by the regional government as fishers, just like engineers were recognized as engineers. And so once they got recognized, the reason why they wanted to get recognized is because they start to look at how much money that field, right, the fishers, how they trade fish, how much they sell their fish for, what's the overall impact on the economy. Because then all of a sudden, once they get that number, the government can be like, oh, this is actually really important. This actually employs a lot of people, not only from a fishing standpoint, but from like a marketing standpoint, selling, fish markets. There's people who support the fishing industry and so forth. And so it becomes like it became a real thing for them, and they felt like they belonged and they were important to the economy. Before, they weren't tracking that information, so people just didn't really think they were important, how much money they brought in. And that really helped. And that's part of social science is providing a voice for people in and around the environment. Yes, the usage of the environment that they're doing might impact the environment, but it doesn't have to be that way. And there might be ways that the less they impact, that they can still do what they're doing, what they want to do, and use the ocean to what they want to do, as long as they're doing it in a sustainable way, and find methods to make it more sustainable. But you can't do that without the field of social science within marine sciences, right? Within marine conservation, and I think that's a lot of people are talking about that. It's why we talk about the effect of colonialism on conservation, and how we need to break down colonialism and give the power back to the local people, indigenous peoples and other local people who know exactly what they need to do to conserve their area and to protect their area, because they've probably been doing it way before Europeans got there. But they weren't allowed to do it. They didn't have that means. They didn't have that empowerment to do it. And now they're starting to get it back, which is great, but we still need to do more work on that, right? And a lot more work on that. And there are people out there doing that, as we speak. And I think that's really important. And that's part of the social science. So the entire point of this, episode is understanding people's needs and understanding what people want within marine science and marine conservation is extremely important. It's something that we need to focus on for the future. Focus on getting people to understand how we behave, how people behave around the ocean and around any of our waterways. Once we start to get that understanding and track it and provide value to it and make it better and help it adapt to the changing environment that we're seeing, and making whatever they do more sustainable and better for the environment, but can still put money in their pockets, still feel powerful, still feel empowered about what they do and around the ocean, and proud of what they do. Because everybody wants to feel proud of the job that they do, of the work that they do, of their local area, their regional area, right? And so that's just the point of the story. This book, which you can find in the link to the article that I'll put in the show notes, is a method to understand that, right? It's a means for us to really read the book, understand the importance of social science, see what examples that already exist and what's being worked on and what's being developed in the future. I think that's going to be really important. So check out the show notes for this link to the full article. I've got a summary in the show notes of the article, but I think it's really important. I would love to know what you think of sort of learning human behaviors and understanding human behaviors in and around the ocean as a method to improve marine conservation. Do you agree with it? Do you have examples of it? I'd love to hear from you. If you could DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. You can email me, speakupforblue.com/contact. Fill out the form. It goes right to my email. Or you can come on the show and tell me what you're doing right now on that, or your thoughts on that. I would love to hear from you. Just like I said in our last episode or a couple of episodes ago, is I want to hear from you. I've already booked a couple of interviews. I'm really looking forward to it. And so you're going to start hearing from people, from community members that are a part of this audience. We're really getting into that community aspect right now. This podcast has an audience. I always like to think of a community, but you can't really have a community until you hear from that community, and you're going to start to be able to hear from that community, and you can be a part of that as well. I'm going to put the link in the show notes if you want to book an interview with me to be on this podcast to talk about marine conservation, to talk about your journey to conservation and or within conservation, and how you're doing, your struggles, your successes. I would love to hear from you. So just hit that Calendly link, book a time. There's some information to fill out, and I look forward. We got some pretty cool people coming up with some projects and all that kind of stuff. I can't wait. So check the show notes, look it up. We got a lot of stuff coming. I'm working on a couple of things, and so it's going to be a lot of fun in the next few months. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.